Good morning, church family. Today we are continuing through our deep dive daily videos, and we're continuing to explore the book of Genesis. In past videos and readings, we've walked through what's happening to Joseph. His brothers rose up against him, hating him as the favorite, and ended up selling him into slavery. And while in slavery, we've seen that he actually ends up being a slave in Potiphar's house, and rises in favor amongst Potiphar's house, and ends up becoming in charge of everything just below Potiphar. And it's here where we pick off, where we transition into something that occurs in Potiphar's home, a temptation that rises against Joseph. If we go back to yesterday's passage, one of the final verses we read, at the end of the verse, it says this: So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. What it says here is Potiphar has trusted Joseph with everything. But one thing that happens is Joseph is a handsome man, and Potiphar's wife begins to take notice. And the passage we're walking through today is Potiphar's wife begins to try and tempt Joseph. She makes her advances at him. She begins to implore him to lie with her. And what we're going to see is we're going to see some things we can learn from Joseph's refusal of that temptation. And we're also going to see how we can learn from what happens after he resists that temptation. But first, we see Potiphar's wife. If you read this morning through Genesis, Potiphar's wife begins to say, hey, Joseph, lie with me. And Joseph gives no thought to that temptation. Joseph immediately answers back with, I cannot lie with you. He mentions that it would be irresponsible and an abuse of the faith and trust that Potiphar has put upon him. But most importantly, we're going to focus on two notes we see in Joseph's refusal of the temptation. First being, Joseph knew who his sin was against, first and foremost. As we've mentioned, he knows, I can't do that to Potiphar. Potiphar's trusted me with so much. But above all, he knew this thing. And in verse 9 it shows, he is not greater in the house than I am, nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? Joseph knew his sin was against God. And at the end of the day, when he chose to sin, when he chose to give into temptations, he knew that it was God he was disgracing. And it was he was robbing glory from God. He was disgracing and displeasing God. And we, church family, we need to make sure that when it comes to our battles with temptation, or when sin comes our way, that we see it with the proper perspective of being against God. Thus, we have the proper hatred and repentance of sin in our own lives. If I don't see it as against God and I instead get hung up on the consequences or other things that come from it, I won't have a proper desire to put it aside and be done with it. I must see it as against God, and sinning against God must be such a terrible thing for me because I don't ever want to disgrace his love. That must be my approach to sin. That must be the perspective. So we see that Joseph has a proper perspective, but also, as famously we've seen in the story, the next thing we can learn from his approach to this temptation is he fled. Joseph ran. He didn't just say no and then stay near her. When she continued to push her advances, he ran from her. Ran from her so fast that he didn't even notice that she had grabbed a part of his clothing because he was making sure he got out of there. So church family, are we running from sin? Are we choosing to stay close and allow it to be near? Or are we making sure I don't want anything to do with that temptation? I'm going to run from it as fast as I can. We must learn both from Joseph, both to see a proper perspective of sin that is against God, but also have the proper approach of fleeing from temptation, not letting it to reside near us. And then we see, after he resists this temptation, after he does the right thing, he still kind of seems to get punished. Potiphar's wife makes claims that he was the one making the advances. She makes claims that he tried to sleep with her. And he tells this to the guard. She tells this to the guard. She tells this to Potiphar. And Potiphar's anger rises against Joseph, and Joseph gets thrown into jail. And it seems like, what? He was righteous. He did what was right. Why is it that he got punished? And I think we can really relate to that. Sometimes we do the right thing. Sometimes we stand up for what we're supposed to, but still we seem to face consequence. And it doesn't seem fair to us that we could ever be punished for doing the right thing. But in this fallen world, it happens. But what we see in this passage is even as Joseph is thrown into prison and is facing consequences for doing no wrong, facing consequences for being a righteous man, we see what this passage ends with was that God still showed him favor and love even while he was in prison. And if we read verses 19 to 23, 19 to 23. As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, this is what your servant treated me. His anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison put Joseph in charge of all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The keeper of the prison paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's charge because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. Even as Joseph may have thought he was treated unfairly, God still moved. God still showed love and God still showed favor. And we see this through every stage of Joseph's life. When he was sold into slavery, he rose in favor in Potiphar's house. When he was thrown in prison, he rose in favor in the prison. And when he eventually gets out of prison, he rises in favor to become the second in command of all of Egypt. We need to trust that as we seek God and seek to honor him with our lives, no matter what happens, even when that righteousness seems to be met with unfair consequences, God is still at work. God is still showing us love. And God is still showing us favor. So church family, we must take the steps to see sin with proper severity and seek to honor God with our every action and flee from the temptations that come our way. And we can know that through whatever happens, God will be glorified and his love and favor will be shown on us, and he will guide us in whatever circumstance we're in. So with that, church family, I pray that we all continue to seek God, seek to honor him with a life of righteousness, and trust that in his grace and love, he will lead us in every moment. Have a great day, church family.